The winds of Fardis. 9 were not like the winds of Earth. They were like the gnashing teeth of a predatory beast, whistling through the jagged rock formations and across the endless, cracked desert. The sun above beat down relentlessly, casting an oppressive heat that burned through the atmosphere, creating a mirage of shimmering heat waves that danced above the horizon. Every gust of wind carried with it the scent of sulfur and dry dust, a constant reminder that this world was not meant to be lived upon, but to be endured. Seraphina, the last royal of the Elori people, had not been meant to endure this world. Her ancestors had once roamed this land in elegance, their cities bathed in a golden glow beneath the twin moons. But all that was lost, erased in the wake of betrayal, war, and greed. Now, her delicate features were marred by the effects of the sun. Her golden skin, once smooth and radiant, now cracked and burnt. Her long, silver-white hair, usually a symbol of her proud heritage, hung in dirty clumps around her face. She had no memory of how long she had been lying there, abandoned in the desert, left to die. All she knew was that her strength was fading, each breath more labored than the last, each heartbeat a drumbeat in her ears, echoing the finality of her fate. The world around her was a blur of shifting dunes and haze, like some fevered dream. Her limbs were too weak to move, too parched to even think about standing. She could barely even lift her head, but she could feel the heat of the sand beneath her, the dry sting of wind on her exposed skin. Seraphina tried to call out, but her voice cracked, dry and weak. Her throat, scorched from the lack of water, betrayed her attempts at anything more than a raspy whisper. She had been forsaken. No one had come to rescue her. The betrayal still felt fresh. Those who had once called her their ally, her people, had sold her into slavery, a piece of property to be discarded. The same empire that had once basked in her power had left her to rot on this forsaken world, hoping that the harsh climate would finish what their betrayal had started. In her final moments of consciousness, a single thought came to her. Was this what her people had come to? Were they to vanish from existence, wiped out by their own ambitions? But just as her eyelids grew heavy, an unexpected sensation washed over her. The faintest feeling of coolness, a breeze. It was impossible in the desert. There was no wind here that could soothe. Yet, this breeze brought with it something else, something she had not expected. Hope. A shadow loomed over her, and she struggled to raise her head. Through the haze, she saw a figure, barely distinguishable from the swirling sandstorm around her, walking toward her. It was a human. The human had no name, not to her, not yet. But to him, she was an enigma, a mystery that stood out in the middle of an unforgiving desert. His name was Jax Thorne, though he preferred to be called just Jax. He had been a mercenary, a wanderer, a survivalist, one who had learned the art of making it through life on his own terms, no matter the odds. The universe had a way of throwing everything at him, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. Or so he had thought, until he received a distress signal, a call for help, something that had led him to this planet. He was prepared for danger, prepared for battle, but not for this. Fardis. 9 was known as a dead planet. The factions that once controlled it had long abandoned it, leaving behind only ruins and harsh weather conditions. But something had drawn him here, some faint signal that had echoed to the vastness of space, pulling him toward the desolate surface. When Jax landed his vessel, he found no sign of life. But as he walked through the barren expanse, he felt it, the strange sensation of being watched. Then he saw her, lying motionless in the sand, a beautiful alien woman, her silver hair almost glowing under the scorching sun. She was like a mirage, a vision of grace amid the cruelty of the desert. Yet there was no mistaking it. She was dying. Without hesitation, Jax rushed to her side, his boots crunching on the sand as he knelt down beside her. His first instinct was to check for a pulse, though it was faint, barely there. He immediately reached for his survival pack, pulling out a small but powerful water filtration device. He knew he didn't have much time. She had been out here for far too long without water. Hey, come on, Jax murmured, his voice low and urgent, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. I'm not leaving you out here. With careful hands, he opened her mouth just enough to administer a small sip of water, the cool liquid a shock to her system. He didn't expect her to respond immediately, but her lips parted, and she inhaled sharply. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing iridescent pools of violet, a color so striking that it felt almost unnatural. Serafina blinked up at the human, her mind foggy with confusion. Why? Why are you helping me? She whispered, her voice cracked, like broken glass. Because you need it, Jax replied simply, not wasting any time on unnecessary words. He had no idea who she was, but his instinct screamed at him to protect her. The galaxy had no shortage of alien species, but there was something about this one. Her ethereal appearance, the slight glow of her skin, the way she exuded a quiet dignity even in the face of death, that made Jax feel like she wasn't someone to be discarded. As she stirred, her hand instinctively reached for him, weakly grasping his arm. Her touch was like fire against his skin. "You are human," she muttered, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Yeah, I am. And you're not dead yet. Let's keep it that way." Jax shifted his stance, preparing to lift her into his arms. But as he did, a low rumble echoed in the distance. Engines, heavy and powerful, approaching fast. The air around them shifted, charged with a new threat. "Raider convoy," Jax muttered under his breath, his pulse quickening. The sound of their engines grew louder, closer. It wasn't just a danger. It was an opportunity for whoever was behind it. They would either kill him or enslave Serafina, and neither option was something Jax was willing to entertain. "Hold on tight," he instructed, as he adjusted his position to carry her securely. "We're not alone here." Serafina, still dazed but slowly gaining strength, tried to sit up, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattered. She knew the desert was not a place to be saved, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir within her, a sense of gratitude, mixed with curiosity. "I thought humans were not fighters," she murmured. "Stick around," Jax replied with a smirk. "You'll be surprised." As the first of the raiders broke through the haze of the sandstorm, their dark figures emerging from the dust, Jax knew this was only the beginning. Jax could feel the tension in the air as the raider convoy emerged from the dust storm. Their vehicles, once sleek and efficient, had been battered by countless battles and the harsh conditions of Fardus 9. The wheels of their sandblasters were caked in layers of dirt, their engines sputtering as the raiders maneuvered toward the pair. Their leader, a tall figure with cruel, sunken eyes, scanned the desert landscape with the predatory gaze of a hunter. Jax knew that look. It was the same one he had seen countless times before, the look that said, "I take what I want." And today, he wanted them. Jax didn't hesitate. With one hand, he tightened his grip on Serafina, making sure she was as secure as possible. She was barely able to sit up, her energy still sapped by the sun's punishing rays. But Jax could feel her strength slowly returning, the touch of her fingers on his arm grounding him. "Stay down," Jax ordered quietly, his voice steady and low. He kept his eyes on the approaching raiders, calculating his options. The sandstorm had created a thick veil of dust between them and the convoy, but that wouldn't last long. These raiders knew how to navigate through it. As they got closer, Jax could see the gleam of weapons, the smirks on the faces of the raiders. There were at least 7 of them, maybe more, spread across 3 heavily armed vehicles. The largest of these was an armored transport, its hull covered in mismatched plates of scrap metal. The others were faster, lighter vehicles, built for maneuverability rather than protection. But speed, Jax knew, was no guarantee against a fight. The convoy slowed to a stop about 50 yards away, their engines growling menacingly. Jax's instincts told him they were waiting for him to make the first move. He wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. As the raiders disembarked from their vehicles, the leader, A broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his face stepped forward. His voice echoed across the desert as he called out, Well, well, what have we here? A stranded human with a pretty alien girl. I didn't think I'd find a slave so quickly on this hellhole of a planet, but it looks like we got lucky. Jax's fingers twitched toward his rifle, but he forced himself to remain calm. It was no use drawing attention to himself just yet. Not until he had a plan. What do you want? Jax asked, keeping his tone even, but the undercurrent of danger was clear in his voice. The raider leader sneered. What do we want? Well, it's simple really. The girl. He pointed directly at Serafina, who was now sitting upright but still leaning heavily against Jax for support. Her eyes glowed faintly, but the fatigue was evident in her posture. She's worth more than you can imagine, and we have a buyer lined up. So you can either hand her over and walk away, or you can make this difficult. Jax's grip on his rifle tightened, his thumb brushing over the activation switch. He hadn't come here looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to let them take Serafina without a fight either. Not happening, Jax replied firmly. You can keep walking, or I can send you to whatever hell you came from. The raider leader chuckled, his hand moving to the blade at his side. Stubborn little man. You're going to regret that. Trust me. Get them. The air erupted into chaos as the raiders rushed forward, weapons drawn. Jax was already in motion. He darted behind a nearby rock outcrop, pulling Serafina with him. She gasped as she stumbled to her feet, but Jax's steady hand guided her. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. This was what he was trained for. The first of the raiders came around the boulder with a plasma rifle raised. Jax didn't hesitate. He fired first, the beam of light searing through the air, striking the raider in the chest. The raider crumpled to the ground, his body smoldering where the plasma bolt had hit. The others took cover behind their vehicles, returning fire in a vicious hail of energy blasts. Jax grabbed Serafina's arm and pulled her further into the desert, trying to find a better position. They were exposed, but for the moment, the raider's attention was focused on him. Can you fight? Jax shouted to Serafina over the noise of the battle. She nodded, though her expression was clouded with confusion. I can do more than fight, she murmured, her voice growing stronger with each word. But I must gather my strength first. Jax didn't have time to question her abilities. The raiders were closing in, their vehicles moving to flank him. He dropped to a crouch behind a dune, grabbing a grenade from his belt. He didn't use them often, but this was a situation that called for drastic measures. With a quick pull, he hurled a grenade toward the raider vehicle on the left. The explosion was deafening. The vehicle's engine exploded in a fiery burst of light, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. One of the raiders was caught in the blast, his body flung backward, smoking and lifeless. The others scattered, but it was clear they were rattled. Jax didn't have long to enjoy the brief advantage. The leader, enraged by the loss of his men, turned his attention fully to him. The raider leader's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. You're going to regret this, human, he bellowed, raising a large, electrified mace. I'll tear you apart piece by piece. Jax didn't wait for the attack. Instead, he sprinted forward, using the cover of the dust storm to mask his movements. He had one shot, one chance to end this. The raider leader was big, but slow. Jax had the speed. He closed the distance in seconds, rolling into a crouch just as the mace swung toward him. With a swift move, he grabbed the leader's arm, twisting it to the side and using his own momentum to slam the raider's body against the side of his transport. The leader grunted in pain, but Jax wasn't done yet. He threw a quick punch to the man's throat, forcing him to drop the mace. Serafina, sensing the shift in the battle, stood tall behind Jax, her glowing eyes now flashing with an otherworldly energy. Her hands trembled at her sides, but as her powers surged, the very air around them seemed to vibrate with raw, untapped force. The raiders who had been advancing on Jax faltered, sensing the change in atmosphere. Without warning, Seraphina raised her hands toward the sky, her voice low but filled with power, as she called upon the ancient energies of her people. The ground beneath the raiders began to tremble. A wave of intense heat radiated from her, and the sand around them shifted like liquid, creating walls of swirling rock and fire that cut the raiders off from their path. The leader struggled against Jax's grip, his eyes wide with disbelief. What are you?" he gasped. Seraphina's eyes locked onto him with a coldness that spoke volumes. "I am the last of the Elorii," she said, her voice a blend of sadness and strength. "And you have made a mistake." With a swift gesture, she sent the leader tumbling backward, crashing into one of his vehicles with enough force to crush the armor around him. The remaining raiders froze, realizing they were no longer dealing with just a stranded human. Jax gave them a cold smile. "You should have taken the walk," he said quietly. The remaining raiders hesitated, their hands now trembling on their weapons. They had thought this would be an easy score, but Jax and Seraphina had shown them that sometimes survival was a matter of more than just firepower. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The aftermath of the skirmish was quiet, but the desert seemed to hum with an eerie tension. The raiders had scattered, most of them either dead or incapacitated by the combined force of Jax and Seraphina. The sand was stained with blood, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and scorched flesh. Despite the victory, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The remaining raiders had learned a hard lesson today, but there was always someone else, always a new threat lurking in the depths of the galaxy. Jax stood over the wreckage of the raider vehicles, scanning the horizon. Seraphina, still breathing heavily from the exertion of using her powers, sat on a rock nearby, her expression distant. Her radiant eyes flickered with remnants of energy, but there was something else there too, something darker, a deep sadness that seemed to weigh on her every movement. Jax had seen that look before, the kind that came with the knowledge of a broken world. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he wiped the sweat from his brow and began to check the raider vehicles, looking for anything useful. The scavenger mentality was ingrained in him. Anything could be used to survive, whether it was weapons, tools, or supplies. He rummaged through the wreckage, tossing aside shattered metal plates and charred remains. One of the raiders' backpacks caught his eye, and after rifling through it, he found a few thermal detonators, a set of lockpicks, and a small communicator. Not much left, Jax muttered to himself, securing the items into his own pack. As he turned back to check on Seraphina, he noticed her staring out across the desert, her gaze fixed on something he couldn't see. "You're not from here," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was careful, not wanting to intrude, but curious nonetheless. "Not from any place I've seen before. What is your name? And what was all that back there?" Seraphina blinked as if waking from a trance. She turned her head slowly to face him, her face drawn with exhaustion, but also a quiet determination. "I am Seraphina of the Elorii," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I was the last of my kind until my people were betrayed. The ones who ruled over us, the ones I trusted, they sold us into slavery. We were used as pawns, tools for their war." Her eyes darkened, her fingers curling into fists as the memories resurfaced. Fardis. 9 was to be our final resting place forgotten, but I was saved. Jack studied her with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. He had met countless people in his travels, soldiers, mercenaries, survivors, and every one of them carried some kind of burden. But there was something about Seraphina that made him pause. There was an ancient grace to her, a history that spanned beyond the stars themselves. And he couldn't ignore the fact that her powers were unlike anything he had ever witnessed. "The Elorii," Jax repeated softly. "I've heard of your kind. They were once great, weren't they? But now," his voice trailed off, knowing there was little point in continuing. The destruction of the Elorii was an old story in the galaxy, one filled with betrayal, conflict, and forgotten promises. Seraphina nodded, her gaze never leaving the horizon. Yes, we were great once. We were the keepers of knowledge, builders of wonders. Our minds were our strength. She paused, her voice barely a whisper. But all that remains is dust. Jax turned away from her and looked toward the wreckage once more. There was a low hum in the distance, the sound of engines, but this time it wasn't the raiders. This sound was different, more organized, more deliberate. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in. They were no longer alone. Someone was coming, and they would not be as easily dealt with as the raiders had been. More trouble? Seraphina asked, sensing the change in his demeanor. Jax didn't answer immediately. He pulled out his communicator, fiddling with the device for a moment before holding it up to his ear. The faint signal crackled, but the message that came through was clear, and it sent a chill down his spine. Jax Thorne, you have 1 minute to surrender the Elorii to us. The voice on the other end said, its tone cold and commanding. We know what you've done. You're not as smart as you think. Hand her over now, and we will spare your life. Jax's fingers tightened around the communicator. The voice was familiar. He had heard it before, years ago, during a mission gone wrong. It belonged to Darius Voss, a warlord who had long been a thorn in Jax's side. Voss was known for his ruthlessness, his willingness to trade lives for profit. But Jax had never imagined he would be brought into this again, especially not with an Elorii royal in tow. You've got to be kidding me, Jax muttered under his breath, but he didn't lower the communicator. Voss, you've been tracking me. I don't track people, Jax, Voss's voice replied, dripping with sarcasm. I find things. And now I've found you. The Elorii isn't just some prize. She's a commodity. You can't hide her, not from me. Jax didn't respond right away. His mind raced, piecing together the last few minutes, the strange events that had led him here. Voss's men had to have been in the area before the raid, waiting for an opportunity to strike. It was no coincidence that the raiders had appeared when they did. They had been a diversion, a means of testing the waters. You've got one chance to make the right decision, Jax, Voss continued, his voice still icy. Hand her over, and I'll let you walk. Refuse, and I'll hunt you to the ends of the galaxy. I'm tired of playing games. Jax's eyes flicked to Seraphina, who was watching him closely. She had heard the exchange, and the fear in her eyes was palpable. She had been betrayed before. She had been abandoned and left to die. The last thing she wanted was to trust another person, only to have them fail her. But Jax couldn't back down. Not this time. He wasn't going to hand her over to someone like Voss. Not after everything they had been through. I'm not giving her to you, Jax said firmly into the communicator, his voice resolute. You'll have to do better than that. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a cold, menacing laugh. Very well, Jax, but you'll regret this. You've made your choice. Now live with it. The connection abruptly cut off, leaving a lingering silence between them. Jax lowered the communicator and stuffed it back into his bag. His heart was still pounding, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He couldn't let Voss get his hands on Seraphina. Not now, not ever. Voss! Seraphina asked, her voice calm, but filled with a quiet dread. Jax nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon as he began to prepare for what was coming. Yeah, he's a bad one, but we've faced worse, right? Seraphina said nothing, but the way she stood tall, poised, and focused told him everything he needed to know. They were in this together, and they were going to fight, no matter what Voss or anyone else threw at them. The engines in the distance grew louder. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't be long now. Jax quickly scanned the terrain. There wasn't much cover here, but he could use the dunes and rocky outcrops to his advantage. They'd have to move fast, stay one step ahead. We need to move, he said, looking back at Seraphina. Grab whatever you can carry. We're not sticking around for the cavalry. Seraphina didn't hesitate. She picked up a few small supplies, water, a couple of energy cells, and slung a bag over her shoulder. The once proud Alori might have been brought to the brink of extinction, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. And if Jax had anything to say about it, she wouldn't be. Together, they turned and ran into the desert, their steps light but determined. Behind them, the sound of engines rumbled like a storm on the horizon, signaling the arrival of something far worse than raiders. But whatever it was, they would face it together. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, an unforgiving sea of shifting dunes. Jax and Seraphina ran, the pounding of their boots on the sand mixing with the increasing roar of engines in the distance. The air around them was thick with the oppressive heat of the planet's twin suns, but neither of them slowed down. Time was running out. Jax could hear the vehicles closing in behind them, their engines growling like predators. Voss's men weren't far off, and the roar of their pursuit echoed in his mind, like the death knell of a hunt. They had no time to think, no time to hesitate. The landscape ahead of them was both an opportunity and a death trap. But Jax had been in worse situations before. He knew that when it came to survival, you had to keep moving. Seraphina stumbled slightly, her energy starting to wane again from the exertion of her powers, but Jax was quick to catch her, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of fire, now flickered with weariness, and the golden glow that had surrounded her seemed to dim. "Hey, stay with me," Jax said, his voice low but insistent. "We're almost there." Seraphina's gaze met his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to pause. Her expression was unreadable, her thoughts lost in the vastness of the desert and the weight of her people's downfall. But Jax could see the flicker of determination in her eyes. She wasn't a princess anymore, and she hadn't been for a long time. She had become something else, something stronger. "I'm not giving up," Seraphina murmured, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "I know what's at stake." Jax nodded, even though the sense of urgency grew with each passing second. His mind was calculating, running through the different routes they could take. The raiders were closing in quickly, and if they didn't find shelter soon, they would be trapped in the open. "Look ahead," Jax said, pointing to a distant ridge that loomed in the hazy horizon. "We can make it there. There's a cave system on the other side. I've been to it before. It'll give us some cover." Seraphina glanced at the ridge, her eyes narrowing as she weighed the distance and the terrain. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the only shot they had. "Let's go," she said. The two of them pushed forward with renewed energy, the sand beneath them giving way to jagged rocks as they neared the ridge. The ground was unforgiving, but Jax had learned to read it well over the years. His instincts were sharp. He knew when to push and when to hold back. Every part of him was aware of the threat that loomed behind them, but his focus remained on the immediate path ahead. There was no other choice. As they neared the cave entrance, the sound of the raider convoy grew louder, and Jax knew they had to move faster. He could see the dust cloud rising from the vehicles as they swerved around the dunes, attempting to cut off their escape. It was a race now, and they were barely ahead. "Get inside," Jax shouted. He pushed Seraphina forward, his hand on her back, guiding her toward the narrow entrance of the cave. She didn't hesitate, her legs pushing forward despite the fatigue that had settled into her bones. Once inside, they took a moment to catch their breath. The cave was narrow, but it offered them some shelter from the heat of the desert. The air inside was cool, a stark contrast to the blistering heat outside. They pressed themselves against the stone walls, trying to make themselves as invisible as possible. The distant sound of the raiders' vehicles echoed through the cave entrance, their engines snarling as they scoured the area for signs of their prey. Jax held his breath, listening intently. The vehicles passed by, their engines roaring, but they didn't seem to slow down. "They'll pass," Jax whispered, his hand still on the hilt of his weapon, ready for anything. Seraphina nodded, though she was still visibly shaken by the encounter. She didn't speak for a long time, her mind clearly still processing the weight of the events that had just unfolded. Finally, she turned to Jax, her voice low but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her words sincere. For saving me. Jax shifted uncomfortably, as he always did when someone thanked him. It wasn't about the praise or recognition for him. It was about doing what needed to be done. You didn't need saving, he said simply, his eyes scanning the cave for any sign of danger. You can take care of yourself. But, yeah, I wasn't about to leave you behind. Serafina gave a small, tired smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was still processing everything. The betrayal of her people, the destruction of her civilization, and now this. Finding herself on the run with a human who barely knew her, but who had saved her life more times than she could count in the past few hours alone. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly, her gaze meeting his. The question had been lingering in the air between them ever since they had first met, and though she hadn't asked it directly, she couldn't help but wonder why Jax, a stranger to her world, had chosen to risk his life for hers. Jax met her gaze, and for a moment there was an intensity to the silence. It wasn't a question that he could easily answer, not because he didn't have a reason, but because the truth was more complicated than a simple answer would allow. "I've seen too much in my life," Jack said slowly, his voice a mix of resolve and something deeper, something unspoken. "Too much death, too much destruction. The galaxy, it doesn't care about people like you, or people like me. We're nothing but pawns in a game no one else even remembers playing. But that doesn't mean we can't fight back. I can't watch someone else fall without trying to do something about it." Serafina absorbed his words, her expression softening. There was something raw and honest about Jax's words, something that resonated with her on a level she hadn't expected. She had lived for so long in a world that only sought to use her, to strip away everything she was, until she had become nothing more than a tool for someone else's purpose. But Jax was different. "Maybe we can fight together," she said quietly, the thought forming in her mind for the first time. "Maybe that's the only way we can survive." Jax nodded, his gaze sharpening with determination. "We will. But we have to keep moving. Voss won't stop until he gets what he wants. And I don't plan on giving him the satisfaction." The quiet tension between them shifted, both of them understanding that what they were embarking on was more than just survival. It was a shared purpose, a shared goal. They were no longer just two individuals running from their pasts. They were a team, and they would face whatever came next together. Suddenly, there was a low rumble, followed by a sharp, piercing screech from above. Serafina's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "They've found us," she whispered. Jax cursed under his breath and began scanning the cave entrance again. This time, the rumble was different, not from the raider vehicles. It was something bigger, something more dangerous. The sound was coming from the sky. He turned back to Serafina, his eyes hardening. "We don't have much time. Get ready." The sky outside the cave darkened as the shadows of ships passed overhead. They were not the raiders. This was something far worse. The rumble from above grew louder, reverberating through the cave's walls, until it felt like the ground itself was trembling in response. Jax's instincts kicked into high gear, his grip tightening around his rifle as he exchanged a glance with Serafina. The air was thick with tension, the quiet broken only by the steady thrum of something large, something dangerous, hovering just outside the cave. "We need to move," Jax said, his voice low and urgent. Serafina nodded without hesitation. Despite her exhaustion, despite the weight of everything she had been through, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The fight wasn't over. It never would be until they were free. But freedom seemed more distant than ever now, with whatever was coming toward them from the skies. They didn't wait. Moving quickly, they darted deeper into the cave, using the jagged walls for cover as they made their way toward an inner tunnel. Jax had come across these caves during his travels across Fardis 9, hidden passages that stretched for miles beneath the surface, like veins in a dying planet. It was here that he had once found refuge from his enemies, and he had hoped that it might offer them a chance at safety. But he wasn't so sure anymore. The screeching noise outside had turned into something more sinister, a heavy, mechanical whirring that could only mean one thing: a dropship, and it was coming straight for them. Jax's hand shot to the side, signaling Seraphina to follow him into a narrow corridor that branched off from the main cavern. They moved quickly, their boots crunching against the gravel as they passed deeper into the labyrinth of stone. "I thought we had lost them," Seraphina whispered, her voice barely audible. The strain of their flight from the raiders was starting to show in the way she moved. Her shoulders were slumped, her steps dragging, as if the weight of the galaxy was bearing down on her. "Voss always finds a way." Jax didn't answer at first, his mind working as he navigated the tight turns and narrow passageways. The dropship's hum echoed in the distance, and he knew they had little time. "Voss is relentless," he said, his voice grim. "But I don't think this is just about you, Seraphina. I've crossed paths with him before. He has a lot of enemies in high places. People who'll pay anything for something like you." Seraphina's breath caught in her throat as she absorbed his words. She had always known that her people's fate was tied to the whims of powerful men, but hearing it from Jax made it all the more real. The last of the Elorii, the lost royal line, was nothing more than a commodity to be traded in the black markets of the galaxy, and Voss had made her his prize. "We need to keep moving," Jax continued, his tone sharper now, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "If they've sent a dropship, then they're not planning on capturing us alive. Whatever they've got up there, it's worse than anything we've faced so far." Seraphina didn't need any more convincing. She pushed herself forward, following Jax as they turned yet another corner. But the deeper they went, the more oppressive the darkness became. The tunnels, once a sanctuary from the heat of the desert, now felt like a trap. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing thick with dust and the stench of decay. "We're close," Jax muttered, his eyes scanning the rough-hewn rock walls for any signs of a passageway that might lead to an exit. He had to be sure they weren't being followed. The caves weren't as safe as they seemed. There were always predators in the shadows. But as they rounded another bend, the sound of the dropship above them grew louder, its engine screaming, as if it were descending directly into the cave system. Seraphina stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with panic. "They're here," she breathed. "They've found us." Jax cursed under his breath, pushing forward. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something terrible closing in on them. The cavern stretched ahead into a large chamber, and for the first time in what felt like hours, they emerged into the open space. The walls of the chamber loomed high above them, and the ceiling was dotted with glowing crystals, casting an eerie light across the ground. But Jax didn't care about the beauty of the place. What mattered now was finding a way out. He spotted it, an old mining tunnel leading upward toward the surface. The entrance was hidden behind a cluster of stalagmites, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Jax grabbed Seraphina's arm and pulled her toward it. "We're not running any more," he said, his voice resolute. "We're going to fight." Seraphina's heart raced as they moved quickly toward the mining shaft. She had never been much of a fighter, not in the traditional sense. Her powers were vast, but they required focus and control. She couldn't rely on them all the time. But as they neared the shaft, she felt something deep within her stir, a primal force that had been lying dormant ever since her people had fallen. The Elorii had once been warriors, too, and she could feel that strength returning now, pulsing beneath her skin. They reached the base of the tunnel, and Jax immediately began to climb, pulling himself up the uneven rocks. Seraphina followed, her fingers finding footholds as she climbed with a determination that surprised even her. They were almost out of time. Suddenly, the cave trembled beneath them, and the dropship's roar intensified, growing closer. Seraphina froze, her eyes wide with alarm. "They're above us," she said, her voice strained. Jax's hand shot out, gripping her wrist as they both looked upward. The sound of the ship's engines was deafening now, and Jax knew they had moments, perhaps seconds, before the ship's crew would begin to descend into the tunnels to search for them. He couldn't let that happen. "We have to move now," Jack shouted. Serafina nodded, summoning all the strength she had left, and pushed herself upward. But just as they neared the exit, a deafening blast of heat and wind hit them. The tunnel entrance above them exploded, sending debris flying. Jax barely had time to throw himself over Serafina, shielding her from the worst of the impact as rocks and dust rained down. He pushed himself up, coughing as the dust filled the air, his heart pounding in his chest. When the dust began to settle, he saw it. The dropship hovering above the cave's entrance, its massive bulk casting a shadow over them. The ship's underside opened, revealing a troop of heavily armed soldiers descending on ropes. Jack stood, pulling Serafina with him. "No turning back now," he muttered under his breath, his voice steely. They didn't have time to think. There were too many of them, and the chances of escaping unscathed were slim. But Jax knew that, for the first time in a long while, he was fighting for something more than just his survival. Serafina was no longer a burden. She was his ally, and together they would take on whatever came next. As the first soldier dropped to the ground, Jax threw himself into action. He fired a shot, taking down one of the soldiers with a single, precise shot. But as the others closed in, he knew this wasn't going to be easy. The fight had just begun. Serafina, sensing the shift in the air, raised her hands, her eyes glowing with the power of her people. Energy crackled around her, and with a swift movement, she hurled a wave of force at the incoming soldiers, sending them flying backward, their weapons scattering across the rocky ground. Jax didn't wait. He darted forward, engaging the remaining soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. His movements were swift, calculated, each punch landing with brutal precision. Serafina stood behind him, her energy crackling in the air as she used her powers to deflect incoming fire and push back the remaining soldiers. The battle raged on, but Jax could feel something changing. Serafina was becoming more than just an ally. She was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Her power and will were both unstoppable, and together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. The heart of the storm was only beginning, and they were ready to fight for their survival. The dust and smoke still hung thick in the air as Jax and Serafina stood among the wreckage of their battle. The dropship, a once proud symbol of the enemy's strength, now lay in pieces, its hulking frame crumpled and scattered across the desert floor. The soldiers who had descended from it were either dead or incapacitated, their bodies scattered like discarded puppets, victims of both Jax's unrelenting precision and Serafina's otherworldly power. The last of them had been sent fleeing into the desert, broken and beaten, but not without a final, desperate parting shot. Jax wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the horizon. The battle had been fierce, and it had drained them both, physically and mentally. But they had won. They had taken on an impossible force and emerged victorious. But even in victory, there was no time for rest. The true weight of what they had accomplished was just beginning to sink in. The desert still stretched out before them, unforgiving and endless. The stars above were no longer a distant dream, but a reminder of how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Serafina stood beside him, her breathing steady but labored. She had expended a tremendous amount of energy in the fight, drawing on the ancient powers of her people. But unlike the last battle, where she had been fighting simply for survival, this time she had fought with purpose. She had fought not just for her life, but for the lives of those who had been lost, for the future of her people. Her eyes were no longer filled with the same quiet sadness that had haunted them earlier. They had shifted, becoming something brighter, more intense. For the first time in a long while, there was hope in those eyes. Jax turned to her, a small, satisfied grin creeping across his face despite the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. "We did it," he said, his voice rough but filled with a sense of accomplishment. Serafina nodded, but there was a wariness still lingering beneath her calm exterior. "We've survived this battle, Jax. But it doesn't mean the war is over." Her gaze swept over the ruins, the once proud ships and machinery of their enemies reduced to nothing but broken metal and debris. Voss is still out there. There are others, too, those who would use me for their own gain, no matter the cost. I know, Jack said, his voice steady, but we'll deal with that when it comes. For now, we need to focus on what we can control. He glanced back at the smoldering wreckage of the dropship. And right now, that's getting out of here. We've earned a break. Serafina gave him a small smile, though it was bittersweet. She had never known a life that included true rest, not since the fall of her people. But there was something in Jax's words that made her believe it was possible. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her beyond this endless cycle of flight and conflict. Maybe the galaxy still had a place for someone like her. They began walking away from the wreckage, moving toward the distant horizon. The wind had died down, leaving behind a strange, almost serene silence. The desert had reclaimed its stillness, and the world seemed to hold its breath. As they walked, Jax looked over at Serafina, his mind racing with the possibilities. "What happens now?" he asked, breaking the silence. "What do you want to do? What's next for you, Serafina?" She paused for a moment, considering his question. "I've been asking myself that for a long time," she said, her voice softer now, almost introspective. "My entire life was shaped by duty, by the expectations of my people. But now I am free of that. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I know that I am no longer a slave to my past. I can make my own choices, and I want to build something better, not just for me, but for those who are still out there, who still believe in the dream of the Elorii, in the legacy of our people." Jax watched her, feeling the weight of her words. For all that she had lost, Serafina was not broken. She was a survivor, and in her, he saw a strength that was unparalleled. She had the power to reshape her future, to lead her people if she so chose. And Jax knew that he would be by her side for whatever came next. "You'll make it," Jax said, his voice resolute. "I have no doubt about that. The galaxy isn't kind, but you're not like the others. You're not some pawn to be moved around on a game board. You're a force, Serafina, and the universe won't know what hit it when you're done with it." She gave him a tired smile, but there was a spark of something in her eyes, a flicker of the fire that had once burned bright within her, a fire she thought had been extinguished long ago. "Maybe we can change things, Jax. Maybe we can make a difference." They continued walking, the harsh desert winds no longer a threat, but a reminder of how far they had come. As they moved further into the unknown, their path illuminated only by the stars above, a new chapter began to unfold. One where survival was no longer the sole focus, but the promise of something greater. Days turned into weeks, and the unlikely duo, now partners in every sense of the word, traveled across the galaxy, taking on new challenges and facing down dangers that would have broken lesser beings. Everywhere they went, Jax's skills as a mercenary and Serafina's unrelenting drive forged an unshakable bond between them. Together, they built a small but formidable network of allies, each one fighting for the same thing, a chance at a future without fear, without the shadow of the past hanging over them. Their journey wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, times when the weight of their past threatened to overwhelm them. But through it all, they remained steadfast in their mission. Serafina learned to lead, not by the weight of a crown or the burden of tradition, but by the example she set, by the strength she drew from her own will and the unwavering support of Jax. In time, the galaxy began to take notice. The whispers of the human who had saved the last of the Elorii, of the woman who had risen from the ashes of her people's fall, spread like wildfire. They became a symbol, a beacon of hope for those who had lost everything, for those who had been abandoned or enslaved. Voss, and others like him, soon found that they had underestimated the power of two beings determined to carve their own destiny. The galaxy would never forget the name of Jax Thorne and Serafina, the last of the Elorii. They would be remembered not for what they had lost, but for what they had built. And as the stars glittered overhead, Jax and Seraphina stood side by side, ready to face whatever the future held. Because in the end, it wasn't the galaxy that determined their fate. It was their refusal to give up, their unyielding drive to survive, and the strength they had found in each other. The human and the Elorii had shown the universe what it meant to fight, to survive, and to live for something greater than themselves.